Hi everyone, Robert Peake here, the Spontaneous Dungeon Master, and I'm being inspired to continue the series on how to use the Spontaneous Dungeon Master's companion, in part because it's gotten a lot more downloads than I was expecting. I haven't done anything to really promote it in any way yet, and people are already grabbing hold of this, and I want to give you just my thoughts. This is a book I prepared for myself to help me be more spontaneous in my own sessions. So I feel like I really need to kind of explain what's in here and how it works a little bit, and hopefully in doing so will help impart to you some of the additional benefit of what this is, how it's helped me to be more spontaneous, and how I think about creating scenarios where I do feel really comfortable to kind of wing it and have fun alongside my players, discovering what's next. So in this section, we're discovering what's next in the context of travel. I recommend once again that you print this out and you put a tab called Travel right before the Overland Travel table page. So we start with Overland Travel. Overland Travel, those wonderful hex crawls, right? I've had almost whole campaigns where the point is really to get from point A to point B, either in a single session over a longer period, right? Where there's all kinds of hazards. It's a dangerous, weird, wonderful world. And you want to show that, but you don't want to have to plot out every step of the way, because frankly, you don't know the exact course that they're going to be taking, what they're going to encounter along the way. You want to discover with them and be ready to improvise and to have fun with what shows up. So Overland Travel we've structured very similarly to the kind of what they call encounter tables you would find in the Dungeon Master's Guide or Xanathar's Guide to Everything, or some of these hardbound adventure books like Storm King's Thunder. They all have encounter tables where you can roll to see what shows up along the course of your travels. This is similar, but in addition to adversaries showing up that you can fight, there's also real opportunity to have things show up that are unusual, things that are specific to the terrains, things that are just generally interesting, to have people show up that are not necessarily adversaries in any way, but are some people to interact with on your journey. Traps can show up, magical things can show up, and so this is an opportunity to make it somewhat coherent and believable that these things would show up in this type of terrain, but really trying not to limit this just to combat. It's an adventure. It's a big world out there. So to show that, the D20 per day, 50% of the time, it's not going to be something you're specifically initiating as something for the players to interact with. You can ask them, what's something that your character notices along the way? And that in itself could be a jumping off point. I had a character once say, there's something flying overhead, but it's too far up for me to see. That thing is going to have to swoop down later. You're going to have to find out what that is. It's too good an opportunity to pass up as a DM. So your players can feed you stuff 50% of the time. And maybe, it's just they discover some nice mushrooms to eat. They have a jolly time by the campfire. They wake up refreshed with the benefits of a long rest and journey on to the next day. That's fine too. If they're just making progress along the way. The challenge and oddities next, those are terrain-specific oddities or things that are challenging about the environment that you're in. And again, all of this you could find in other places, but the point of this is to put it all in one place, to really consolidate it down to 7 or 8 pages that you can use in this compendium, this companion, along with everything else. So you don't have to carry a lot of books. You don't have to rifle through a lot of different places to find exactly what you need. So I highly recommend that you tune this, that you go ahead and edit this to taste, or even create your own tables entirely from all of the different sources. All the source materials are cited in the back, so you can go and gather that material and decide what you like best. But these challenges and oddities by terrain I just thought were a fun way to spice things up in a non-combat kind of way, and in themselves can lead to a whole adventure, right? If it's something they want to explore that leads to something subterranean, whip out the 5-room dungeon concept, and next thing you know, they're exploring a dungeon they weren't planning to be checking out on their journey across the forest. So those are terrain specific, and then we get into what we call encounters by terrain. These are generally adversaries, but not always, and they're going to be by level or by tier more specifically. So you're not necessarily throwing something at your players that's just way too difficult for them to be dealing with in any way. And then there's the concept of encountering something by day versus by night. So by night, very often your players are going to be setting up a standard watch order. So if something happens at night, someone's going to be on watch, others are going to be asleep, potentially not in their armor. And based on the watch order, some people may not be getting their rest that night if whatever's happening at night takes a long time for them to interact with. Travel discoveries. This one is not specific to particular terrain, but is kind of these general things that you could probably drop in just about in any terrain, again, to make things interesting without necessarily having to throw a goblin at them to fight. So we'll talk about all of those in a minute. And then traps. Traps I put into the dungeon section because that's where traps most likely show up. But traps can exist in the wild and in overland travel. Certainly had a whole part of a session where the group was riding out of the forest on horseback, and one of the players got garroted by an adamantine wire that had been strung between two trees. Literally nearly lost their head. It was a horrible injury. And then the question was, who put this here? How long ago? What's the deal with all of this? And that all just came from a trap roll. So we'll talk a bit more in the dungeon section about how to assemble traps. If combat occurs, I always like to give the option that combat could occur again within the same day, because frankly, a fresh high-level party that has one encounter, and then a long rest, and one encounter and a long rest, isn't going to be terribly challenged. So a bit of a resource drain can be actually a lot of fun for everyone if it's like, oh no, I used up most of my spell slots and now there's another encounter coming at me. If they're moving at a particularly fast pace, they're more likely to encounter stuff that they don't just narrate. If they're moving at a particularly slow pace, it's more likely that they're going to spot stuff and be able to evade it and do the narration themselves. And for every encounter, you want to consider, is this enough? Is this enough flavor? Is there enough spice already in this stew? Or is it possible that with an encounter complication, something about the terrain or the situation, it's a little different than your typical, party and adversary facing off over an open field, that will make this more exciting to run and to play. So that's how I use the Master Overland Travel. As I say, a great many adventures can start simply from, we got to get from point A to point B, and we don't know what's going to be happening in between. So this gives you a lot of options to make stuff happen in between, to make stuff exist that your players can interact with, and you can riff on from there. Travel discovery. So again, this is the typical format for this book. 5 D20 tables, or a table that you could then just roll a D100 on to get one at random. Unmarked settlements, wanderers, people and creatures that are wandering through, not necessarily adversaries. Something ancient. Again, I like my world to feel like it's been built layer by layer on past civilizations, some of them potentially forgotten. And so these ancient things can be showing up that are huge, that are old, that are mysterious. Magical, so there's definitely a magical field or something at work here, and that in itself can lead to investigation, can lead to unusual effects happening. And finally, something natural you could come upon that may or may not be appropriate for the terrain, right? So a geyser, in the desert, or a tall, waterfall or a water spout in the middle of the ocean. So these can be a lot of fun to throw in to, again, give that sense that this is a mysterious, magical world built on top of past civilizations with all kinds of stuff going on in it. And these can be dropped in anywhere. So again, you can roll on the table, or you can just say, look, I want them to discover something. Let's find out what it is. The next several pages are by terrain type, so that it's appropriate to the terrain, the type of creatures you're encountering, or the type of natural elements or oddities. So I won't go through all of the actual creatures. They're more or less trying to be appropriate for the tier that the party's in. But the nature and oddity elements, the challenges, the first 10 there, are things that the party's going to need to make a skill check about to avoid some kind of consequence, such as slowing down their movement, taking some actual damage, being blinded, being suffering a level of exhaustion, being thrown overboard in the case of a ship. All of these things lead to complications that then, if there is some other challenge later on, they're at some kind of disadvantage, or something has occurred to where a bit of their resources have been drained. Now they've got a compound, complex situation to deal with, and in itself, it can lead to a whole session, a whole game. Then the things that you would encounter in this particular terrain, so in the aquatic terrains, half-sunken ship, or St. Elmo's fire, or a narwhal, all kinds of things. And this goes on. So for each of these, the desert encounters, the forest and jungle encounters, the hills, moors, and plains. I kind of put those together. The mountainous encounters, the swamp encounters, and finally the tundra encounters. So a lot of these challenges are similar, but they're specific to the type of terrain that you're working in. And of course, those natural elements that they come across are also very much terrain specific. The final page of this that I want to give you an overview with, and I think is really important, and something I think I underutilize at times, is that combat just on its own isn't necessarily nearly as much fun as when there's some complicating element. Such as wind, that if you move in one direction, you can move almost twice the speed, but if you move in the other direction, your movement is halved. All your ranged weapons are at disadvantage. There's this big, strong wind whipping up. And this wind also could affect fire, right? If someone lights something on fire, that could start raging through the natural environment. Wind is a great one. Poison gas, a wild magic zone, a zone of darkness, or maybe the foes are not only there, on the ground, but there's an extra element of aerial support that's going to make it particularly hard, and that they might have to run for cover. So compound things, usually even two things. So it's an encounter and a complication, or it's some natural oddity, and then there's some kind of setback or problem with that's specific to the terrain. Or they have one encounter and then they have another encounter later in that same day. Combining these kind of things makes for a rich, interesting experience that's much more than your typical, all right, let's roll on the table. Okay, you guys find 6 goblins, everybody roll for initiative, and we're going to have a little fight. So that's a lot of how I run the natural world when people are traveling from point A to B outdoors. And like I said, it can lead to all kinds of interesting things that your players in character can interact with. And that's kind of the key. It's not so much about setting up an encounter, staging it, knowing where it's going to go. It's more about dropping stuff in there and then having the confidence to then, go with it. If they get if they take a hostage, go to the NPC section, grab a voice, let them be interrogated. If they make it into a town that night, go to the cities section, pick a name for a tavern, start creating some color there. If they find an underground passage, go to the dungeon section and create a 5-room dungeon and fill it with some interesting things and have an adventure there. So terrain need not be just kind of fluff or filler or a way to get to the action. It can be the action. It can absolutely be the action. And hopefully with this travel section at your fingertips, you can make that a much more rich, spontaneous experience for yourself and for the players.